What if the real reason you keep explaining yourself is because you're talking to people who never intended to understand you in the first place? Some people don't want clarity. They want confusion because in the fog they hold power. They don't need to win the argument. They just need you to question your own voice. You explain yourself to feel understood, but they interpret it as permission. Permission to interrupt, to correct, to diminish. And slowly, you start shrinking every time you open your mouth. Your clarity becomes currency in a conversation you didn't even want to buy into. You think you're being honest. They think you're being weak. You think you're offering peace. They see it as leverage. And by the time you realize you're repeating the same sentence 5 different ways to someone who's already made up their mind, you're drained not just of words, but of worth. This isn't communication. It's a psychological tug of war. And every time you explain yourself to the wrong person, you hand them the rope. The Stoics understood this long before it became a modern psychological term. They knew silence isn't withdrawal, it's mastery. In this episode, we're not just talking about how to stop over-explaining. We're identifying 7 specific types of people who twist your words, drain your clarity, and keep you stuck in emotional negotiations you never agreed to. If you've ever left a conversation feeling smaller, heavier, or strangely guilty for speaking your truth, you're about to understand why, and you'll never explain yourself the same way again. You weren't always like this. You used to speak with ease, with presence, with power. But slowly, almost invisibly, you started editing your sentences before they reached the air. You started clarifying things no one even asked about. You apologized for the tone of your voice before you even finished your thought. And somewhere along the line, you stopped communicating. You started performing. You didn't plan for this. It began innocently. Someone misunderstood you, so you explained. Then someone twisted your intention, so you explained again. Then someone stayed silent, but punished you later with distance. So you over-explained, hoping your kindness would soften the blow. But it didn't. It taught them something else. You'll bend your truth to keep their peace. What you didn't realize was this. The more you explain yourself to the wrong people, the more they train you to doubt your own clarity. This is how the erosion begins, not through rage or rejection, but through repetition. You're pulled into conversations where your words are never enough, your motives are always questioned, and your silence is seen as guilt. It's emotional erosion disguised as dialogue. And the more you explain, the more exhausted you become, not just physically, but spiritually. You think you're being the bigger person, you think you're maintaining peace, but what if you're just negotiating with someone who profits from your confusion? The Stoics warned against this form of quiet self-betrayal. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject. Yet here you are, explaining yourself to people who aren't qualified to hold your truth." This isn't humility. This is emotional misplacement. And over time, it convinces you that silence means surrender, when in fact, silence is a decision. But before you reclaim your silence, you must recognize what you're up against. Because not all people who demand explanation do it out of malice. Some do it from fear, some from insecurity, others, yes, some from manipulation. But all of them, knowingly or not, have the power to fracture your clarity if you keep giving them access. That's why today is not about one-size-fits-all advice. It's about discernment. It's about identifying the 7 specific types of people that every Stoic should guard their truth from, not because they're evil, but because they don't treat your clarity with care. Some don't deserve your truth, not because they're bad, but because they keep turning it into a battlefield. And no matter how noble your words may be, truth cannot survive in a space where it is constantly weaponized. They always come back, not to listen, but to loop, not to heal, but to hover. The repeater doesn't argue with force, they argue with fatigue. You've explained your boundaries. You've clarified your words. You've said again and again, what hurts, what's unfair, what's enough. But none of it lands, because landing would mean it's over. And the repeater isn't here for closure. They're here for control, dressed as confusion. So they ask again. But it's not real curiosity, it's strategy. They reopen old wounds with new phrasing, feigning miscommunication as a mask for manipulation. Their favorite phrase is, I just want to understand. But what they want is for you to stay in the emotional courtroom, where you are the defendant and they are the judge who never dismisses the case. Every time you try to move on, they whisper, let's talk one more time. So you talk, and you find yourself justifying things you already made peace with, questioning things you were once sure about. Until eventually your clarity is in ruins, scattered across a battlefield of circular conversations. The Stoics warn us, clarity spoken more than once is not clarity, it's captivity. Epictetus said, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. But the repeater doesn't want embodiment. They want engagement. They feed off the friction. If you are calm, they provoke. If you are silent, they poke. If you are direct, they say you're overreacting. And so the loop tightens. You start to shrink, not physically, but philosophically. You begin to doubt your right to peace, your right to walk away, your right to say, this conversation is done. But it is done. You already said what needed saying. Stoic wisdom teaches that you owe your clarity to yourself, not to someone who keeps misplacing it. So instead of re-entering the courtroom, you step out. You close the door, not in anger, but in authority. And if they call you heartless, distant, cold, so be it. You would rather be misjudged than manipulated. You would rather hold your peace than rehearse your pain. Because real clarity doesn't repeat itself. It simply stands, silent and unmoved, like a lighthouse in fog. Let them spin. Let them repeat. Let them circle their own confusion like a drain. You are not their anchor anymore. You are the shore they can no longer reach. They're always quick to agree until you need them to stay. They mirror your values, your pain, your story until it's no longer convenient. The shifter doesn't argue directly, they shift context. One day you're close, the next they're distant. Not because of what you did, but because standing near your truth costs them too much reflection. They'll say, I'm just processing, or you misunderstood me, or this isn't what I meant. But underneath the vagueness is a quiet refusal to be accountable. The shifter is allergic to definition. They weaponize ambiguity to escape confrontation. You try to make sense of what changed. You replay every word, looking for the switch. But there was no one moment, only a slow turning of the tide, so subtle that you blame yourself for not noticing the drift. And because they never clearly oppose you, you hesitate to oppose their absence. So you explain. You explain your tone, your timing, your intention. You explain until you're no longer sure what the original truth was. Their magic trick is turning you into the unstable one. But Stoicism teaches that stability is not about maintaining relationships. It's about maintaining alignment. As Marcus Aurelius reminds us, if someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth. The shifter, however, seeks convenience, not truth. They nod when you speak, but they vanish when it matters. They don't confront your perspective. They evaporate around it, and you're left holding a conversation with a ghost of consistency. In time, you start hesitating before speaking, afraid the air will shift again. You soften truths, you reshape boundaries, hoping they'll stay. But you're not in a dialogue. You're in a dance with someone who changes rhythm every time you find your footing. The Stoic path requires a different posture. It asks you not to chase clarity from those who thrive in fog. It tells you, speak once, hold your ground, let those who shift drift. And when they do, don't follow, don't fold. Because explaining yourself to someone who rewrites the rules mid-sentence isn't communication, it's self-erasure. When you encounter a shifter, the strongest response isn't to convince them of your stability, it's to demonstrate it. You remain calm when they withdraw. You remain kind when they distort. But most of all, you remain rooted in the truth you spoke. Because in a world full of shapeshifters, presence is the rarest rebellion. They smile when you praise them. They glow when you agree. But the moment you hold a different view, something shifts. The light dims. The warmth disappears. Suddenly, you're not a safe person anymore. You're a threat. So you explain. You soften your words. You over-clarify your tone. Not because you're unsure, but because you're afraid of losing their approval. This is the invisible prison of the validator addict. Someone who needs constant emotional affirmation, not truth, to feel secure. And if your words don't serve their validation, they will reject the words, and sometimes you with them. It's subtle at first. They applaud your strength when it aligns with their needs, but challenge their opinion, express a boundary, or simply fail to mirror their emotional state, and they withdraw their warmth like it's a punishment. You don't even realize it's happening until you notice your speech patterns bending toward their comfort zone, not your conviction. You start phrasing things in ways that keep them soothed, even if it costs your own clarity. And every time they pull back their validation, you chase it by explaining more, revealing more, shrinking more. The Stoics warned us not to anchor our peace in others' opinions, especially when those opinions are conditional. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say, or think, or do." But that tranquility is hard to reach when you're caught in the emotional economy of someone who sees your truth as a transaction. The validator addict does not argue. They don't shift the subject. What they do is more insidious. They condition you to equate disagreement with disconnection. And in doing so, they shape your identity into something safe, predictable, agreeable. Over time, you don't just fear confrontation, you fear abandonment. So you explain, you clarify, you pacify, not for understanding, but for emotional survival. But here's the catch. The more you bend your truth for someone's validation, the less they trust your authenticity. The more agreeable you become, the more invisible you feel. And the tragedy is, in trying to keep their connection, you lose your own voice. Stoic resilience teaches us that self-respect isn't loud. It's consistent. It doesn't need to shout. It needs to stay still. When dealing with a validator addict, stillness is your greatest protection. Don't dance for their approval. Don't dilute your clarity to maintain their affection. Speak once, with presence, with respect, with your full voice. Then let the silence test the connection. If they disappear when you stop performing, they were never with you. They were with their reflection of you. And that's not a relationship. That's a mirror. A Stoic doesn't explain themselves to a mirror. They simply walk past it, whole. They always look composed, controlled, carefully curated. Every word is measured. Every smile is practiced. They know what to say and when to say it. But the moment your truth threatens the image they've built, the mask begins to shift, not with rage, but with subtle disappointment, a raised brow, a silence too long, a compliment withdrawn. They won't argue, they'll imply. They won't confront, they'll vanish. The image player doesn't need to win with facts. They win with perception, and perception to them is everything. So when your truth doesn't fit the version of reality they want others to believe, you're not just disagreeing, you're destabilizing their brand. And to protect that brand, They will manipulate the conversation without you ever realizing you've lost the thread. You'll find yourself backpedaling, softening your edges, adding disclaimers to every sentence, not because you're unsure, but because you fear being labeled as too much, too reactive, too intense. And so you explain, not to be understood, but to not be misunderstood publicly. You edit yourself for the audience they might be performing for. This is emotional stage management, and you're no longer a speaker in the conversation, you're a character. But Stoic philosophy doesn't perform. It doesn't dress for approval. It stands in its essence bare, unmoved. As Seneca said, he who seeks wisdom should be more concerned with the truth of his words than their reception. The image player flips that wisdom on its head. They are less concerned with truth, more concerned with reception. Their piece is cosmetic, their presence curated. And when your rawness doesn't match their polish, they subtly turn the crowd against you, through insinuation, through omission, through withdrawal. You find yourself explaining not just what you meant, but who you are. You defend tone, timing, temperament, not because you were wrong, but because they've made silence feel like guilt and disapproval feel like judgment. Over time, you learn to scan every moment, anticipating their reactions before you even speak. You rehearse integrity in the mirror of their expectations. But Stoic resilience cannot live in performance. It lives in presence. A Stoic does not shrink for optics. A Stoic speaks, not to impress, but to express. When faced with the image player, your only protection is alignment between your inner truth and your outer expression. Speak it once, cleanly. Don't polish it for their image. Don't dilute it to keep their admiration. If your honesty cracks their mask, let it crack. Because you were never speaking to the real them. You were speaking to their performance. And no amount of explanation can make an actor drop the script. But your stillness can end the scene. You tiptoe around them, even when you're the one hurting. You dim your joy so they won't feel small. You dilute your anger so they won't feel blamed. And you package every truth in soft wrappers because their reactions are glass, and every conversation feels like walking barefoot through a mirror factory. This is the emotional toll of dealing with the fragile mirror. They reflect everything back, but warped, cracked, and centered on their pain. Your hurt becomes their injury. Your boundaries become their rejection. Your silence becomes an accusation. So you explain. You explain to assure them you're not abandoning them. You explain so they don't spiral. You explain until your clarity disappears under a pile of their feelings. And by the time the conversation ends, you're the one apologizing for having a need, for having a voice, for existing outside their comfort zone. The fragile mirror doesn't attack, they collapse. But in that collapse, they make your truth feel cruel. They force you to choose between being honest and being kind, and then weaponize your kindness as guilt. The Stoics would call this a false dilemma. As Epictetus reminds us, if someone does wrong, teach them with kindness. But if they cannot be taught, walk away in peace. But how do you walk away in peace from someone who shatters when you speak? The answer is not harshness. It is stillness. It is the refusal to absorb the broken glass of another's emotional fragility. When dealing with the fragile mirror, you will be tempted to make your truth smaller, softer, more digestible. But you must resist, not with aggression, but with gentle clarity, because shrinking your truth to spare their discomfort does not protect them. It corrodes you. And over time, you'll begin to fear your own voice. You'll become a version of yourself so edited, so delicate, that you forget what strength sounds like. And in that silence, the mirror only grows more fragile. But a Stoic does not fear someone else's feelings more than they honor their own. A Stoic speaks calmly, not cruelly, but does not apologize for existing at full volume. So you speak once, with care, with stillness, with precision, and then you stop. You do not cushion the blow they imagined. You do not fix the emotion they projected. You let the mirror break, if it must, because you were not sent to hold their reflection together. You were sent to be whole. You've said it all. You've explained your truth, your intentions, your boundaries. You've replayed the past, clarified the present, and drawn clear lines for the future. Yet somehow you're still here, still explaining, still defending, still repeating a conversation that should have ended weeks ago. Welcome to the prison of the loop designer. These are the people who do not seek closure. They seek circulation. They thrive not in resolution, but in repetition. They engineer emotional mazes where the exit is always just one explanation away. But that explanation never satisfies, because the goal was never clarity, it was containment. You find yourself returning to the same topic under different disguises, first as confusion, then as curiosity, then as concern. They ask just one more question. They just need one more perspective. But every new attempt at understanding becomes fuel for more misunderstanding. You give them logic, they offer doubt. You give them vulnerability, they return uncertainty. And just when you think you've closed the loop, they open another. The Stoics warned us of such entrapments. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste time arguing what a good man should be one." The loop designer isn't interested in who you are. They want to keep you explaining who you are, over and over, until you lose your footing in your own story. You begin to second-guess your intentions. You wonder if maybe you weren't clear enough, kind enough, careful enough. But it was never about clarity. It was about control. The loop designer doesn't need you to be wrong. They just need you to keep justifying yourself, because in that state, you're softer, more compliant, easier to shape. You become emotionally worn, intellectually exhausted, spiritually fragmented. And that's the point, because the more tired you are, the easier it is to rewrite your truth. They don't confront your values, they wear them down. And like a stone smoothed by years of waves, you begin to lose your sharpness, your edges, your voice. Stoic clarity doesn't chase understanding from those committed to misunderstanding. It simply stands. You say your truth once, cleanly, calmly, completely, and then you stop. Not because you're done caring, but because you've started conserving your time, your peace, your energy. You refuse to re-enter the loop. You step outside the maze, even if they accuse you of arrogance, coldness, avoidance. Because a Stoic does not measure truth by how many times it's accepted, only by how clearly it's lived. When dealing with a loop designer, the most radical thing you can do is stop playing. You answer once, you rest your case, and then you walk, not in anger, but in alignment. Because your life is not a courtroom, it's a compass. And it points forward, not in circles. They never raise their voice. They don't insult you. They don't slam doors or send cruel messages. No, the quiet punisher has a more elegant weapon: absence. Not the kind of absence that says, "I need space," but the kind that says, "You will pay." You said something they didn't like. Maybe you were too honest. Maybe you challenged a pattern. Maybe you finally spoke a truth you were afraid to say. And now, they vanish. Not completely, just enough. A slower reply, a colder tone, a shift in gaze, a withdrawal of warmth so precise it leaves no fingerprints. You ask if something's wrong and they say, "It's fine," but you know it's not, because you felt this punishment before. And so, once again, you explain. You over-explain. You search for the right words to make them feel safe again, to restore the invisible harmony that shattered when your voice rose into the space their silence controls. The quiet punisher doesn't argue, they withhold. They don't correct you, they condition you. Over time, your body remembers the cold, and to avoid it, you become more agreeable, more cautious, more edited. You speak with disclaimers. You tiptoe inside conversations. You preemptively apologize for truths you haven't even spoken yet. And eventually you start mistaking peace for their approval, when in fact you've only learned how to silence yourself before they can. Stoic philosophy warns us against giving power to subtle tyranny. Seneca wrote, "A mind unwilling to be guided cannot be helped. A mind unwilling to speak cannot be healed." The quiet punisher makes healing impossible because they use silence not as reflection, but as retaliation. You find yourself playing detective, interpreting pauses, decoding one-word answers, chasing the warmth they once gave freely. But this isn't intimacy, it's emotional taxation. And every time you pay with your voice, you lose something sacred: your clarity, your dignity, your courage. Stoicism invites us to stand in truth, not to tiptoe around someone else's reactions. So what do you do when faced with quiet punishment? You stay present. You do not chase their mood with explanations. You do not buy back affection with silence. You speak once, clearly, kindly, completely, and then you stop. Not as an act of war, but of self-respect. You recognize that some people don't need your clarity. They need your submission. And the most radical thing you can do is not provide it. You let them sit in their silence, not because you're cruel, but because your truth deserves more than a hostage negotiation. When you refuse to bow to the unspoken, you invite either growth or departure. Both are forms of peace, and both are better than living under a smile made of ice. You are not here to be decoded, diluted, or doubted. You are not here to explain your soul to those who demand performance instead of presence. Somewhere along the way, you learned that love meant proof, that connection required convincing, that being a good person meant staying silent to keep the peace. But peace without truth is just quiet fear. And fear is not the Stoic way. You've met the repeaters, the shifters, the validators, the image players. You've spoken your truth in front of mirrors too fragile to reflect it. And with every loop, every silence, every emotional tax, something inside you whispered, "There must be another way." There is. And it begins not with louder explanations, but with deeper stillness. The Stoic path is not cold or distant. It is warm with clarity and rich with restraint. It honors others, but never at the cost of self-abandonment. From now on, you speak once, with presence, with peace, with precision, and then you watch. Not with judgment, but with awareness. Because how someone responds to your truth reveals more about their soul than yours. If they punish, distort, disappear, or circle, know that it was never about you. It was about their need for control. And now, finally, you are done being controlled. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with a calm so grounded it can no longer be manipulated. This is not the end of your kindness. It is the beginning of your sovereignty. And if that feels unfamiliar, it's because you're finally stepping out of explanation and into embodiment. So let me leave you with one final question. If you no longer owed anyone an explanation, what boundaries would you build to protect your inner stillness? In our next video, we'll explore the 9 boundaries Stoics use to protect their peace, not by shutting people out, but by standing firmly within. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's tired of over-explaining. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your truth. And if you're ready to stop bending and start becoming, subscribe for more Stoic clarity in a noisy world.